Right, welcome back to another episode of the Demand Podcast. I am your host, Jonathan Bland, co-founder of Omni Lab, and today I am joined by Nate Turner, who I came across actually on LinkedIn, just seeing some of his content. He's been producing some really interesting stuff. He actually has a podcast of his own, which you should check out, which I'm sure we'll put a note or a link or something at the end of this. But he's the co-founder and CEO of 10Speed. They're a content marketing and SEO agency. So we're going to be getting into a whole bunch of things regarding content marketing and others. So again, welcome to the show, Nate.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I'm really excited to chat today.
Cool. Well, before I kind of give like a little, hopefully not a rant, and hopefully we can have some fun with it. Why don't we just do like a little quick plug just for like those that haven't heard of 10Speed real quick? I mean, what is it that you guys do, and what are the types of clients that you work with?
Yeah, we are a content optimization agency, and we work primarily with B2B SaaS companies, but also a little bit in B2C and direct-to-consumer e-commerce.
Mm-hmm.
And we work with companies to kind of develop the strategy to create content primarily for their blog, but really kind of understanding how to attract the appropriate audience, create content that will perform and stand out, and then attract them to the site, and then from there kind of work with them on CTAs and kind of figuring out how to actually convert and move people into the funnel. So we have been doing that for about a year and a half now, and have been growing and helping a number of clients in that.
Love it. And I think from our previous conversations, predominantly like seed to Series B-ish, B2B SaaS companies, and mostly in the US, right, as well?
We do have some international, but yes, mostly kind of seed to Series B. And in most cases, we're finding, Series B, Series C and beyond, they're sort of at a point where they're then building it in-house. And in some cases, we're kind of helping augment or, consult in some of those ways. But for the most part, seed to Series B.
I think that works well, because I think most people that are listening to this, most people in my network, and it sounds like probably yours too, are in that stage. They're seed to Series B. So this is going to be hopefully pretty relevant, because a lot of them have the same types of issues when it comes to content marketing. So we can kind of dig into that. But I want to kind of kick it off with just some thoughts that I have, and then you and I can, whether you disagree, agree, we can kind of go back and forth on it a little bit. But the way that we see it, in terms of just the current situation, what happens with content marketing right now, and maybe I'll just kind of paint the picture in more of a story format. But typically what we see is a marketer will say, all right, what campaigns do we want to run for this month, for this quarter? And they'll start identifying things like, hey, maybe we should put together this guide, this ebook, whatever it may be. So they start putting together that long form piece of content with predominant goal of driving, getting an email address or driving lead gen from that. They'll spend about a month, sometimes less, but usually more than that, actually creating that piece of content. Then they'll distribute that out in a number of different formats, traditionally in paid formats, but sometimes in other formats as well. And then what will happen is, some leads will start coming in, quote unquote leads, and then those will ultimately get passed into a nurture sequence that needs to be set up in the back end to nurture all of those people that actually are consuming the content. From there, then hopefully they have a lead scoring engine set up. Some do, some don't. So that's another thing to contend with as well, in terms of deciding, hey, should we actually reach out now or should we reach out later based on signals? And then that gets passed to an SDR. SDR will typically qualify it. 99%, 98% of those people will really not be interested quite yet in actually having a discussion, given that there's just not a lot of intent around downloading a piece of content. And then you just won't see that kind of funnel through the funnel. And we've seen this kind of time and time again. Luckily, most of our clients aren't in that, kind of spinning wheel around running that play. But again, we see this across so many. And I think for anyone that even wants to challenge this idea, I mean, go into your CRM and just ask the question, hey, last 6 months, last 12 months, like how many of those content downloads have actually turned into pipeline of revenue? And then two, just to confirm how many people are doing this. Again, you look at your LinkedIn feed or Facebook feed, we're seeing, I would say 85% easy of people that are running the same types of plays on both of these channels. And again, I'm coming from a paid perspective. You're going to have probably some different angles too that I might not hit on. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on it too.
Yep.
But that's kind of what we see in terms of like the current landscape. And I think the problems, of course, that creates is that there's just a lot of effort putting together all this content, right? And getting it out, getting it distributed, et cetera, when they could actually develop content that really just kind of met the buyer where they are. And the last point on this is that when you start creating content with a goal of, getting a lead out of it or getting an email address, the objective of the content changes, right? So you're not necessarily all oriented around trying to provide value to the buyer and just answer questions that they have. Every content needs to serve a purpose, which means that it needs to tie directly back to your product somehow. And the issue with that is that ultimately we want to build more of a community. We want to answer questions, a lot of other things that can be hit on. And not everything needs to be a piece directly relating back to your product. And many times people don't find those pieces that valuable, right? They're really looking to actually solve other problems. So I think there's a real challenge, at least that we see with respects to creating really, really good content that adds a lot of value. Of course, maybe there's a piece of content here or there that kind of slowly ties back to the product, but ultimately you're here to like serve the customer. So I think that, how we see this kind of moving forward, at least my perspective, and then I'll kind of pass it over to you, is that I think what we're starting to see with a lot of companies is the move towards saying, hey, not everything needs to be lead gen oriented. We can still create content, a great blog article, or whatever format that's going to be in. It could be a podcast, could be a video, it doesn't matter. But let's create something that we think is really valuable for them. And let's just do this over a period of time. Let's judge the success based on how much they consume the content versus how many leads we get out of it. And ultimately what you'll see is a lot of times is the leads will come and you just won't actually see that they're necessarily connected to a specific piece of content. You'll just know that, hey, the content was consumed and that they're ultimately coming in and they're more qualified, they're more ready to go because they're thinking of you. You were the person that was there kind of providing a lot of value. So yep. I'll stop myself there, just kind of like lay out kind of some things that I see and some challenges, but maybe you've got some perspective on that we can ping pong on a little bit in terms of some of the challenges that you see, biggest issues that you see with content marketing with B2B SaaS.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's quite a bit to unpack there. I think you're spot on with that sort of that traditional flow of, build an ebook, gate it, get the leads, put it in, goes to, all those steps eventually to SDR. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of challenges there, especially when you look at the way the tools, the marketing automation tools sort of coach people in that direction of, build a scoring model that's going to, award more points for being here or there, or, like these things that are fairly arbitrary unless you have a substantial amount of data to analyze to truly say these touches are worth more than something else. Otherwise it's made up. And therefore that's where the whole issue comes into marketing saying, this is qualified, and sales saying why, they're not ready. I'm chasing them down. So, when I was at Sprout Social for over 8 years, and we certainly went through iterations of that. And where we landed on a lot of that was, one, we're generating thousands of leads a month just from those sort of like low intent things like ebook download, webinar, whatever. Those can either be extremely cold, but not quite as cold as like pulling an email off of Zoom info. 1 degree warmer, I would always say, than like just pulling it off of a list for outbound, because at least they've heard of your company and they've engaged in some way. But what we really found was like, it just was better to just keep giving them great, valuable content. So not trying to send it to sales, not trying to market as an MQL, but just continue to send them great blog content, continue to send them, invites to webinars or recordings or whatever. And eventually they build up to the point where they do become high intent and they start a trial or they request a demo. And so that really worked well, even to the point where we would shift and really ungate a lot of our content, but then provide the option to download, a PDF version, in which case you kind of get the best of both worlds, because you have the benefits from search and it's being indexed and more people are seeing it, but then there is still some component of generating a lead or capturing an email in that case. So I think there's that aspect of it. And then in terms of the time and effort, I totally agree. I mean, there's a lot that goes into that, and especially thinking about it from a lead gen perspective, and really continue to build that. So I think that's where we see a lot of companies sort of need to mature out of that. Like, it typically makes sense early on, but then eventually you kind of need to mature out and say, what are the goals we have for lead gen? What are the things we want to do for that? What are the things we have for just pure like product education. It can be beneficial to prospects and customers, and thought leadership, brand awareness, brand building type of things that we aren't going to say, hey, did this generate any leads? Like, you don't need to measure the brand awareness content that way. And so I think that's a big part of it, is just understanding how to mature out of that and not create every single thing with the intent of lead gen.
Totally agree. I mean, I think the follow up there that I think a lot of people struggle with is like, how do you do that, right? And I think that there's a lot of people that either have a CEO or a founder or whoever they report to that says, listen, if you guys are going to go out and create this piece of content, that's great, but we need to know what the results were from that piece of content. We need to know, how many leads came from it, how much pipeline is produced, and how much revenue, right? Because otherwise, I'm not going to pay you guys for a month and an outside agency, maybe even potentially, to create this piece of content and then not have anything to show for it. So I think that, like, how do you think about, going through that conversation? I don't know if it's something you did at Sprout Social or other companies or the brands you work with, but have you had that conversation before where there's an intense focus on that and saying, hey, listen, there's a place for having different types of content that are just purely answering questions, objections, pains, things that your buyers want to learn about, and not actually worry about it having to be a lead in your CRM system?
Yep. Yeah, it's always interesting because at the end of the day, we're humans, and every CEO or leader is a human, and every human is different with different biases and everything. So that's always challenging. But I think a couple of the core things to say there. One is, I've often coached people, like, just kind of have that dialogue with CEO and just say, like, what is an amount you are comfortable with that, like, if it's $5,000 or 10 or 50 or whatever, what are you comfortable with us spending on this, knowing that we're not going to track any leads, we're not going to try to measure ROI, and whether that's over a quarter or a year, kind of like figuring out what that sort of ongoing spend can be, that there's comfort knowing they've kind of approved this amount, it's something they've said they're comfortable with, and then you kind of know the parameters you can work within to start building towards that. And maybe over time you can say, hey, look at the engagement we're seeing, or here's what we're seeing or hearing from sales that people loved this white paper we put together, or whatever it might be. So I think that's one aspect, is just having that conversation of what's the level that you're comfortable with. And then the second, I think, is that you often will have this sort of dual nature with a CEO. One is like, they're still early stage. There's like, cash burn is real. They need to hit marks to reach that next round of funding. So they're very conscious of performance. But at the same time, they want to build, the next HubSpot, the next Zendesk, the next big, huge, well-known brand. And so I think sometimes it's that conversation of saying, we agree, we understand where we're at, we know we need to hit numbers, we're not like moving away from that, but let's take a step back and think about where we want to go and look at what those companies do and understand that they're not able to measure everything back to lead, and that's just sort of part of getting to where you're ultimately wanting us to go. And so let's agree on a timeline as well. So similar to the amount that you're comfortable with, like, maybe it's not this year, but maybe we say, hey, next year, let's hit numbers and let's start to test some things, but then next year we'll really start to invest in some of those things over, our like 5 to 7 year plan.
Right.
Kind of think of it that way. So I think that's typically helpful, is to kind of understand again, like, well, what are you ultimately trying to build, and looking at that and understanding, okay, well, yeah, someday I realize we'll have that, so we do need to start building towards it.
Got it. So, I mean, I guess in summary, what you're saying is, I think key port is definitely got to align with, upper management on the strategy. You need to understand what the budget's going to be and what they're comfortable with allocating to a campaign that's not necessarily directly, at least in the short term, going to generate leads. And then ultimately we need to establish a timeline around when we think, how long this is going to run, these types of campaigns, and ultimately when we might start seeing results around these types of things. And if we can rely on those three things, then we're getting down the road to say, hey, we can now try new types of content. Not everything needs to be a guide, an ebook, a gated piece of content on LinkedIn. We can actually open up and start answering some questions and actually change and write new pieces of content that maybe we haven't written before. And I think, my kind of take on this is, at least the way that we approach it is, if we do have a company like this, typically the first step is, let's actually just look at the historical data within the CRM, and let's understand, all right, for all of the content downloads that have come in, like what's happened with those, where have they moved throughout the
Yep.
funnel? And generally we try to look at a favorable time period, something 6 months, 12 months, to understand what happened there. Typically, what we find is that ultimately a lot of those haven't converted into pipeline or revenue, and ultimately they're just still sitting at a lead nurture, or they've been followed up and kind of hit up on by SDRs many times. But again, like there's not been a lot of success. And frankly, even I can speak directly to this. I was
Yeah.
one of those people in the sales role following up on a lot of those guides and ebooks. So I know how it felt. And I remember when I was a salesperson, it was like, shit, I don't want to go after these guys. I mean, like no one's really
Yeah.
interested with them. So,
Yeah.
so I think that the first part is like, let's get some data in front of the CEO and say, hey, here's what we're finding, here's what we see. And in some cases, when they haven't run gated content, we might even run gated content to get some data on it to prove that out, right? Sometimes you've got to do things that maybe potentially don't work in order to get the
Yep.
data to then say that, frankly, yes, this is the fact. Like the data says this. So that's the first part. And then after that, we need to go and say, all right, what's the measure of success of this content, and align on that and say, I think this goes back to your point, and
Yep.
make sure we say, all right, hey, what is the goal of this content? What are we trying to accomplish here? And ultimately, what we're trying to do is how do we educate, add value, answer questions, potential objections, ultimately help our buyers be more successful in their roles that they're in right now. Like how
Yep.
do we do that, and how do we create great content that actually accomplishes that? And then what we'll do is when we run content like that, we'll really more look at consumption of the content as a leading indicator to say, hey, are people enjoying the content? Are they engaging with it? So you might look at time on page or session length, et cetera, in GA to
Yep.
understand what type of impact that content's having. And that's what we report back and say, hey, look, like we're getting way more consumption of this content than we've ever had before. Back when we had, the guide of the ebook, the consumption was X. Like there were downloads, yes, but consumption's way up. That means that we're getting more messaging, our perspective, and more
Yep.
value delivered to those buyers than we were before. Isn't that what we want? Isn't the
Yep.
goal to deliver messaging out there, whatever channel? I mean, whether it's organic, paid, doesn't really matter. The goal is to educate them. So I think like that's kind of how at least we think about it. And then ultimately, if you do that really well and align on that in the beginning, then it opens things up. And now the content, like going back to your point, now the content gets to be much more a scenario of, all right, now we can do some things we never thought of doing before. Now we can do these other content types that traditionally would have never run because we know we just wouldn't have gotten a lot of leads directly out of it,
Correct.
you know?
Yep. Yeah, totally agree. I think it's like, to your point of looking at the data, I think being realistic about the math behind it. Because if you were to say to a CEO, hey, I want to spend $200,000 this year on content, and it's likely, maybe we'll indirectly generate some revenue, but like it's mostly going to just build our audience, build brand awareness. It outright would probably just say no, or have some serious questions around it. But when you do the math and you're like, well, we have two full-time people that are creating ebooks and creating all this stuff and putting on the site and doing all the marketing automation, and we have 5 or 6 SDRs, and they're following up on people, and like here's how much revenue we've gotten from that, and you add up all the salaries and benefits and all that stuff, and it's probably $300,000 easily in the kind of your all-in CAC for that. So even from that perspective, it's pretty easy to kind of look at that, but see the difference of like sometimes people will gladly put bodies on something to kind of run that motion of lead, and then people following up, but have more concerns around spending the same amount on something that's ultimately going to generate about the same. So
Totally.
I think
I love
yeah.
what you just said, just to interrupt you. I love what you just said, because I think that's a really, really good point, is just start adding up the costs, right? How many SDRs do you have? And if it's not full-time, then how much part-time, how much are they utilized following up on ebooks, guides, etc.? What does that motion look like?
Yeah.
Then it's what tech do you have today? How much are you spending on tech and marketing automation tools, lead scoring, etc., to actually run this play successfully? Because I mean, you really do need to have some of those things set up to run the play well. And
Yeah.
again, that's why HubSpot, of course, has tons of marketing material around running it, and why their system, of course, is very good at doing it, because it's self-serving, right?
Yep.
And then there's the content itself that takes time, to your point. So whether you outsource it or whether you insource it, doesn't matter. There's a cost to it. And then of course you've got sales as wasted time potentially, not just SDRs but also AEs that are potentially getting past these leads that really aren't that ready.
Yeah.
But guess what? SDRs need to deliver on a number. They need to convert a handful of these into SQLs and move them over to sales. So then they're kind of in a crappy position where it's like, oh, man, I just got to get this over. It meets our ICP. I don't know. The guy's not interested, but go talk to him, right?
Yeah.
And then you get that pass off. But then again, it just starts wasting people's time. So I think that's really, really key what you just said there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that the other thing I was going to mention earlier is if and when you do have the ability to generate content that is not directly lead generating, whether it's just starting to build more blog content that is sort of going to pay off in the long run, or more top of funnel, or other brand building things. I think one key thing that I've seen trip people up is not splitting out those aspects in reporting. So if you're like, hey, we're going to run awareness campaigns on paid social and just target this bucket and really just get our name out there, and you lump in that cost and those impressions and clicks and everything into the same direct response type of stuff, all it's going to do is just wash everything out. Or even if it's broken out by campaign, it's going to look terrible because it's going to have basically no leads or an extremely high CPL, and it will just get cut. And so I think that's an important factor, is when you have that ability to kind of run some of that separately, being able to really split it out and say, well, here's our true CAC and CPL and whatever that we're measuring, and then here's the performance of everything else. And you may have other on-site engagement or different metrics that you want to add to that, because it's not purely a performance thing.
I think that mindset changes, right? So the way that you traditionally would think about LinkedIn or Facebook when running gated content, or just with the goal of getting an email address out of that, is you do have to understand very closely, like, what is the cost per lead? What's the CPA? What's our CAC from the existing channel? You need to look at like channel by channel to understand that. But when you start saying, hey, we're just going to use these channels as distribution mechanisms, mediums to deliver a message, to deliver content out to our audience, out to our ICP.
Yep.
And ultimately that's the goal, right? And within what we're going to do is we're going to measure that by looking at the aggregate. We're going to look at overall how many new inbound demo requests are we driving to the business, how much new inbound pipeline, how much new inbound revenue, et cetera, and look at CAC and CAC payback, et cetera, but using the full weighted cost of marketing in that sense, versus saying and pointing the finger, well, look, Facebook isn't doing its job, or LinkedIn isn't doing its job.
Yeah.
Or your website isn't doing its job in terms of doing it. Ultimately, it's just about driving more inbound, period.
Yep.
And that's the trick to it.
Yep, absolutely.
I wanted to get into, so in terms of like creating content. So I think that like everyone, we're talking a lot about like, moving from like lead gen to, building more content that's really kind of addressing, a whole variety of different problems and being less lead gen oriented. But then how do you create good content? I mean, like, do you guys have a framework, the way that you guys think about it, to create content that really resonates with buyers? Like, what are some of the things that you see that either people are doing really well in terms of creating content, if you've got some examples, or even the vice versa, that some issues where you see that like the content's not that great, but like, how do we, ultimately the question is like, how do we create good content that resonates with buyers?
Yeah. I mean, from our perspective, we are an agency with a fairly specific focus, and kind of we fit into a specific part of the marketing org typically, in terms of creating SEO content that's really focused on being optimized to rank and attract the right people. So I think from that perspective, a couple of the factors are, one, alignment up front is extremely critical. Understanding ICP, even if they don't have jobs to be done, research done already, we'll try to kind of like quasi figure that out with them, good enough that we can directionally be doing our research in the right areas, and like selecting the right topics. So I think that's key, not just looking at search volume and trying to get them the most traffic and getting traffic for the sake of traffic, but really bringing in the right people. And then from there, there's certainly a number of tools that a lot of folks use to kind of understand, whether it's, ClearScope or any of those tools, like they can kind of see what are the factors that should be included in a certain topic to rank. The problem is that that's backward looking. It's just analyzing what's already there and telling you, based on what's already there, here's what you would put in. And so that's why you see a lot of like people call commodity content or, carbon copy type of things where like the posts look the same, read the same. So that is a factor it's an input in our process, but it's not, the end of the process. And so I think the other piece is studying what's there and figuring out like how to be different, how to have a different approach, a different perspective. And then the last piece being to have really good input, subject matter expertise brought in from the company. And that's actually true. Like that's not a motion that most in-house teams have either. Like if you're on the marketing team, sure, you generally understand the product and everything, but you're not necessarily getting that true subject matter expert perspective on a lot of these things. So like, for example, when I was at Sprout, social media management product, our marketing team, we're creating content, but we're not necessarily people that are being director of social media day in and day out. So like, we aren't doing that work. We're not like in it, as our role. So like that is actually a missing component that I think both in-house and agencies have a lot of times. So we do really capture that to make sure we can kind of pull in a company's perspective. And so between all those things, we know we're creating content on topics that are going to resonate with our audience. We do understand the search components and what it will take to perform. We know how to differentiate and make it not just be a copy of everything else in the SERPs. And then, making sure we have that kind of unique perspective and subject matter expertise to make it better quality and more valid. So that's it from the SEO content perspective. And then I think, outside of that, for companies creating good content, I think it continues to be, whether it's ebooks, webinars, any of that, just being like extremely tuned into what your customers' pain points are and what's going on. So I think that's something that is becoming a bigger thing, like customer research and stuff. It's not just limited to like product teams anymore. I think marketing is doing a much better job of actually going out and understanding what's going on a day in the life of their customer, those types of things. So I do think that continues to be extremely key. And then outside of that, it's, I think a lot of ways you can also make it better is just looking at what are some of the unique advantages you have, whether it's, we have 15,000 customers and we have all these data points. And if we just turn loose a data scientist to go find some interesting data points, we can actually have some unique first party data to have, include in our content and do, like Gong is really good at that. A number of companies that they really just kind of have their own insights and then build great content around it because it's unique and it's not something that people can get elsewhere. So I think those are definitely, a couple others that are extremely helpful.
I love that. If I could kind of categorize and organize what you just said, because I think you said a lot of really great things there. So first, I think it starts right at the top. So just jotting down some notes here. It starts at the top. Customer research has to be done from the beginning, and there has to be a very detailed understanding of the customer. Now, it could be possible that SaaS company really understands their customer well already. That would be the ideal situation. In a lot of situations, they don't. That research needs to be done. How can that be done? Lots of different ways. Ultimately, I think the best way could be to start a podcast. It could be just to reach out and start talking to existing customers. It could be listening to recorded calls from sales. It could be talking to sales directly and getting feedback to hear what they're saying. Because again, sales is on the phone with these people, hopefully, all the time, listening to how they're describing the pain, the questions that they have, all sorts of other things. So I think a lot of learnings can come from that. So I think that's step one. And then step two, to what you just said, is then we need to take all that research and then detail out all the pains, all the wants, all the desires, all the questions, and detail that into literally 4 headers could be an easy way to do it. And just write those down from the perspective of the customer. Like, I want to build better content, or how do I build better content might be a question. And the question that we're trying to ask, that's a blog post right there, because all people want to create better content that ultimately drives more people in. So then once you've got that together, then you can go in and then you've got to implement perspective, which is what you said as well. And I think that's really key too. no one cares that you're just regurgitating out everything that anyone else said. They want to know what you think. That's frankly why like podcasting, I think, is blowing up, is like, they want to know what Nate thinks. They want to know what I think, whether
Yep.
I'm wrong or right, or they disagree, agree, it doesn't matter. But people
Yep.
just want to know what your stance is on it. And I think that's the missing link. I think a lot of times the content, it's more like, these are the facts. Here's what MQL means. Here's this or that. Not, here's how we think you should be doing it. And I think
Yep.
that creates a lot of value to me. And then the last part that you mentioned, which I think a lot of people struggle with, is the SME. Hopefully that's the founder or the CEO, because they should be the closest people to the customer. That's why they built a product around hopefully a pain or a market need. And again,
Yep.
not always the case. But yeah, if you don't have someone that, like for us, like we market to marketers, so that makes our job easier. But for those marketers that are marketing to like people manufacturing or engineering roles, our role, it's very different than yours. You're probably going to need some type of SME internally to be kind of the person, the voice of creating that content. I think you and I talked about this before we even got on this podcast, where your team will actually sit down and they will do interviews with the
Mhm.
SME and with the person that knows the customer the best. And then what you guys will do, and you could fill in the gaps here, but what you guys will do is build out a whole list of questions so that you can get all of the juicy details on like, hey, what's the perspective? What's the goal of the content? What are we trying to write about? And then that gives your writers a lot better ability to write something that's really going to hit
Yep.
versus, hey, Nate, can you and your team just kind of create a piece of content on XYZ thing? And a lot of agencies will say, yeah, sure, we'll spin something up, right? So they do some research on Google and they kind of copy and paste some things, created a little bit of new word and call it a day, right? And there's
Yep.
so much of that content out there, not enough of what's your stance, what's your perspective. So I don't know if that's a good summary there, what you just said, but
Yeah.
to break that
Yeah.
down.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's great.
So I think moving from creation, then we move down, and then it's all right. Well, how do we get this out into the world for them to view it? And I think clearly you're coming more from an organic perspective. I come more from a paid perspective. I think both are very important, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on distribution and then also repurposing. And just to say a
Mhm.
few words about it to kind of kick us off, I think that whether it's webinars, events, all sorts of things, there's so much attention around actually getting people to the event, getting people to the webinar, acquiring the first set of people to actually consume the content. But then ultimately, what happens with a lot of brands, and I bet you anyone listening to this would feel this way, where you go to your resources page, and I guarantee you that you're not actually spending any money, whether paid or trying to organically repurpose that content out on social platforms like LinkedIn, Facebook, et cetera, or wherever your audience is hanging out. You're not going and doing that, so the content just sits there in your resource library, and then it just sits in the ether until someone finds it on organic, where you could actually get
Yep.
that content out in the areas where people are actually hanging out, and then bring more people in to get more consumption of it. So an example of this is Metadata, who was just on the podcast yesterday. They took their demand event, and most marketers will know about this. They took their demand event and they actually started pushing advertising to the videos and the webinars and the things like that, the event itself that they already ran. So that
Yep.
way they're not only getting the juice off of the initial event itself and getting people to it, but now they're bringing people back and they're sending it to people that may have not ever heard of Metadata. So they're
Yep.
getting a lot of value from that. And I think that's really smart. So I'd love to hear your thoughts though, because I think it's challenging and it takes time. And then ultimately, like creating good content is really, really important. But without distribution and making sure that you're getting that content in the right places, it makes it very difficult for it to be consumed.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, so certainly our number one objective um, within our team is to help companies distribute via organic search. So
Yep.
ranking and getting that traffic. But we are always very vocal about the fact that like you're spending all this time creating great content. Like, why would you just wait for it to rank, whether it ranks in 2 days or 2 weeks or whatever? Like, there's so much more you can do with it. And so that's where we're not doing the work necessarily, or even really building strategy, but often saying, if any of this, like, share this with your sales team. Maybe not everyone uses it, but there are always reps that'll just love that you're sending them stuff and find ways to send it along to a prospect, including it in your newsletter,
Mm-hmm.
breaking it up like you said. Typically SEO content is very well structured, and so you typically could take just about every H2 section of a blog post and turn that into a social media post, and get 3, 4, 5 posts out of any one blog post. things like that. So I think that's extremely important and definitely a piece that's overlooked. One, I think it's not really like a role in company. Like people don't have like content distribution specialists who
Mm-hmm.
are sitting there doing that. It's either like a social media manager will do some stuff,
Mm-hmm.
or an email marketing person will grab it. So I think that's a problem. It's just the way that teams are structured. It's just sort of uh, like an afterthought for a lot of people. And then I think the other is that we tend to try to cram in as much new stuff as possible in our strategy and in our plans, and we
Mm-hmm.
don't leave any room for repurposing or any of those things. So I think it's just a prioritization issue as well. That
What?
yeah.
Yeah. Well, why do you think, what I see a lot of SaaS companies do, and I know you see this too, is they take the blog article that they wrote and that they tried to rank for in SEO, and then they just repost that same article, link to it organically on LinkedIn and Facebook, and they call it a day.
Mhm.
Like, is that a good idea? Do you agree with that? Like, why is that seems to be kind of like the lowest, the easiest thing to do, I guess, right? I mean, what's your stance on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think something I talk about quite a bit is like the so what question that you just kind of have to keep asking yourself, like, which you're basically in that case posting it on social, but you have to ask yourself, like, so what, like, why does this matter, and so you could do that if you have a really solid text in your social post that really leads into explaining so what and like why they should go read that. But I think 9 times out of 10 people are not going to go be like, oh cool, based on this short 70 character title, I
Mm-hmm.
definitely want to go read this. Some will, but
Right.
it's better to pull that out and have some of the meat of that content really hit people directly.
Right.
And then if they want to learn more, they can go back through and read all of it. Same thing with the webinars. I mean, I think um, that's an area that back when we were doing co-marketing stuff at Sprout, like we did not see a lot of people engaging and watching recorded versions of them from our resources section. It just wasn't something that they did. And even if we did push paid to it, it still was, it's a big jump to be like, oh cool, a topic, I'm gonna go watch this for an hour or 45 minutes or whatever it is. And I think now there's so much, it's much more popular, and there's better tools to like make clips of things
Mm-hmm.
and actually share clips from it. And I think that's something that most webinars, back then that was just not something we were doing. And even now, I think a lot of people doing webinars aren't really grabbing some of those clips like you would from a podcast and
Mm-hmm.
share them, which then again kind of pulls some important parts out so someone doesn't have to watch all of it. But then again, if it's really hitting, that topic's resonating, you can go watch the whole thing. So
Exactly. I think that's the key. Well, so I got a couple things to say to that. So one, I think you're right. So especially with a cold audience that doesn't know you, hasn't heard of your brand, etc., they're not going to be the people that like read your whole blog post. They're not going to be people that read all this long form content or listen to your whole podcast. Those are the people that are probably hanging out on social media or whatever other platform, and they're consuming micro content and they're just consuming little bits of text, etc., and trying to see what's interesting to them. Because again, they're stimulus driven platforms. So the goal is, hey, don't try to just put your blog post as a link. I mean, I see this all the time. It's like, yeah, we took the blog post and we sent it out on our Slack channel. We told all of our sales team and our CEO and everyone to post it to social. And all they do is they grab the link, copy and paste, and they throw it into social and they call it a day, right?
yeah,
People, LinkedIn number one doesn't like when you do that, because LinkedIn and Facebook and all of them, like their incentive is to keep you on the platform. So
yeah,
just by sheer nature of the algorithm, they don't want to have people going off the platform, because then that's less ad dollars for them. They want more impressions.
yep,
So that's one thing. But then two, it's like people just want to scan and skim. And I think to your point, you're right that it's about breaking down the content into a little micro posts and taking the H2s, et cetera, breaking them out into little things, maybe even putting your perspective on it too, I think is important, especially if it's coming from a personal profile. It's not just a company page thing. Let's throw it on our company page.
yeah,
It's going in and saying, hey, here's my perspective. My name's James and I'm an AE at this company. And here's my take on this. And maybe it's still a little bit of copy and paste from what the article said, but it's a little bit different. It like has your take on it. And I think again, that's still important that each person in the company has a voice. it isn't just stemming down from one person who actually wrote the content. So I think those are a couple really, really important things that folks can take and hopefully learn and think about, because again, LinkedIn is going to disincentivize you from actually sending people off the page. So let them read a little bit of it. And then in the comments section, throw the link if you want down there. Usually that's kind of the best practice for anything doing in LinkedIn. And if they want to read more, then let them read more when they want to read more, et cetera. And the same thing what you said with podcasts. Most people are not going to probably haven't heard of your podcast. They don't want to listen to long versions. So take a little clip, something you thought was really valuable or insightful, throw that up there, 2-3 minutes or whatever it is, and then call it a day with a little bit of adhering text.
Yep. Yeah. And I think it's, you can also just kind of, sometimes it's helpful just to kind of look at what some of the big names are doing. He does 3-hour podcasts. Tim Ferriss does extremely long podcasts. They're not just posting them and saying, here's our 3-hour podcast. Like, they break out so many clips from those and post each one to YouTube and TikTok and everything. And like, they're everywhere. And that's just the reality of it, is like, there's, they would be missing out on the long tail of consumption by only posting a 2 or 3 hour podcast and saying, please listen to this. 2 minutes, 5 minutes here and there. Like, it's just so much, but it's all short, and you still get the point across. You still make the impact. So I think that's a little bit, is just sort of maybe allowing yourself to separate from the craft of, but I spent all this time, I created this long episode that's really good, or this huge guide, or this huge post that's really well written, and allowing yourself to let it be cut up into more bite-sized pieces.
Totally agree. Well, I think hopefully some people got some value out of this. I think it was a good conversation, because again, I think the important takeaways for me is, making sure, number one, that content's goal is not only generating an email address out of the piece of content. The content's goal is to educate, build awareness, answer questions, and address pains for your buyers. So I think that's a really key point. Yep. The secondary thing to actually achieving that is making sure that you align with your CEO, align with the board, or whoever you've got to report up to, that this is the strategy, this is the plan, and this is how we're going to measure it, looking at the consumption of the content more so than actually looking at the amount of leads we get from that specific piece or that specific channel. Instead, we're going to look at the aggregate of that and say, overall, over these months of creating really great content and starting answering questions, are we driving more inbound demos, inbound pipeline, inbound revenue, and what's the efficiency of our marketing engine? So I think that those are the key points. And then always with everything, I think if I could take one thing that I thought I liked that you said the most, because I think it's the thing that lacks in all content, is perspective. Put your perspective on it, whether it's, you posting it out and you're the A, like we just talked about, putting your perspective on it and, having a thought, or whether it's the person's actually writing the full long piece, have a point, have an opinion, have a view, and say, like, this is where we think people are doing it today. Here's the problem with it, and here's what we think they should be doing in the future, and give them that path and to make it as actionable as possible. I think would be the last thing that I don't think you and I talked about, where I see a lot of this content is kind of like all theoretical and abstract. Like, I can't really do anything with this. Like, can you give me something and give me a template, or give me a step-by-step framework? And maybe it doesn't work exactly for me, but maybe I can take some ideas from that and then pick and choose the things that work for my business. I think it's a great summary. I think it just kind of highlights that, it's not, hey, let's go create content and it'll grow our business. There's a lot of components to it, and each one kind of requires being thoughtful and, being intentional about how you resource it and how you think about it, how you measure it, how you communicate, and all those things. So it's a great summary of that, and also just really enjoyed this conversation. Love it. Well, then for folks that do want to either follow you or stay in touch either with you directly or 10Speed, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you? Yeah, so you can find us at 10speed.io, and 10speed.io/podcast is our podcast called Content That Grows. And you can follow me on LinkedIn. Username is Nate Turner1. Cool. Awesome. Well, cool. You heard it here, guys. Thanks again, Nate, for joining, and we'll definitely have to do this again soon here. Yeah. Thank you. Cool, man. We'll see you.